Yeah. In my last program, I discussed the destruction of at least two Patriot missile systems, launchers, with their associated vehicles near the town of Pokrovsk, a fact which has been confirmed not just by Russian telegram channels and commentators, but also in the Western media, and, as I understand it, within Ukraine itself. Puzzlingly, as at the time of making of this program, there has been no confirmation about this from the Russian Defense Ministry. We will probably get confirmation of the destruction of these Patriot launches at the end of the week when the Russian Defense Ministry provides us with its weekly summary. I ought to say that I have now seen various commentators suggest that alongside that Patriot system with its two launchers that was destroyed close to Pokrovsk, that a S-300 system, a similar S-300 system operated by Ukraine, was also destroyed. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has mentioned the destruction of the S-300 system. They have not spoken about the destruction of the Patriot system and its attendant launchers and vehicles. I presume that there is some reason for this, but I'm not going to try to speculate as to exactly what that reason is. Anyway, there we are. It looks as if, or some at least are suggesting, that an S-300 system was destroyed as well. In which case, of course, the disaster that Ukraine has experienced in terms of the loss of air defense assets in the Avdiivka direction has just been compounded even further by the loss of another valuable system, the S-300 system, which is comparable, and some say even superior in some respects, to the Patriot system itself. Perhaps in order to rub the point home, the Russian Defense Ministry has just released video of a Russian Sukhoi 25 ground attack aircraft. That's the Russian equivalent of the American A-10 Thunderbolt, operating in the Avdiivka direction. The Russian Defense Ministry says that the aircraft was subjected to a heavy degree of jamming, electronic interference by the Ukrainians, but that this didn't affect its ability to complete its mission. And the video, in fact, shows it operating over the skies in the Avdiivka area without apparently being concerned about any possible threat. Now, that suggests to me the fact that the Russians are using a ground attack aircraft like that in this area. Sukhoi 25s fly reasonably close to the ground. They operate very much on the front line. The Sukhoi 34s and 30s and 35s that launch the big bombs, the big precision-guided gliding bombs, typically launch them from some distance from the location that they're aiming to strike. The bombs glide to their targets, guided by the various systems that enable them to strike the location precisely. Anyway, the fact that the Russians are able to use ground attack aircraft, subsonic ground attack aircraft, like the Sukhoi 25, over the Avdiivka area, suggests to me, at least in my uninformed way, that the Russians are pretty confident that the air defense situation, the Ukrainian air defense situation in the Avdiivka area at least, has, for the time being at least, been shattered. Now, that was my discussion yesterday about the destruction of the Patriot air defense system. Today, we've seen pictures appear of another Abrams tank destroyed in BITCHUTE, making this apparently the fourth tank of this kind, Abrams tank, destroyed in BITCHUTE. And apparently there's a report circulating that the commander of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade, the unit which operates these tanks, apparently he's been sacked by Syrskyi, who is angry with him because these valuable and important American tanks, very symbolic of the American commitment to Ukraine, 4 of them have been destroyed by the Russians in BITCHUTE over, I think, a period, a 10-day to 2-week period. So, anyway, head of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, he's been sacked. So we are told. How that changes or improves the situation for the Ukrainians in BITCHUTE, I'm not going to discuss further. Whether it is a question mark over the way in which these tanks were operated in BITCHUTE, that's again not something I'm really competent to discuss. I recall Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis on programs that he has done with us at the Duran, and of course he's somebody who has actually led Abrams tanks into battle. He has said that Ukrainian commanders are far too young and inexperienced and lack the necessary training and knowledge to know how to use tanks like this in an effective way on the battlefields. And I discussed in a previous program that I really couldn't see the sense of using valuable tanks of this kind in penny packets in places like BITCHUTE. And I'm not saying that that is what Colonel Davis would say. That is something that I'm not in any conceivable position to comment about. That would be for him to say, not for me. But anyway, I just mentioned that fact. So maybe there are problems and mistakes with the way in which the 47th Mechanized Brigade has been deploying these tanks. If so, it would not surprise me. It is consistent with my inexpert impressions, and it is certainly consistent with what Colonel Davis has said about the ability of the Ukrainians to operate these tanks. Anyway, that's one point I would make. Brian Beletic has done a very interesting recent video in which he's discussed the destruction, not of this 4th tank, but of the 3rd Abrams tank in some detail. The Russian Defense Ministry said that the 3rd Abrams tank in BITCHUTE had been knocked out in some sort of tank duel by a Russian T-72 B-3 tank, a modernized T-72. And Brian Beletic makes actually a very interesting point. It's a fascinating discussion that he has provided in his last video. He discusses the way in which some American commentators and Western commentators developed misconceptions about the T-72 based on the American experience of fighting Iraqi troops using T-72s in the 2 wars that the United States fought against Saddam Hussein's forces, the one in 1991 and the one in 2003. And Brian Beletic points out that Saddam Hussein's T-72s were first generation T-72s with simple armor, a relatively low power generating engine, that they lacked thermal images, and that they do not compare remotely with the heavily modernized and far more sophisticated T-72s that the Russians operate, which have thermal images, ballistic computers, much stronger, much more advanced compound armor, explosive reactive blocks, which provide further armor protection, all kinds of sensors, all those sort of things, and which have a much wider and more extensive range of weapons. Going back to things that Colonel Davis has said, not just on our programs, but in many articles that he's written discussing these things, he's also pointed out that when the tank duels between the Americans and the Iraqis took place, the American tankers, whom he led and commanded, and I presume partly or perhaps largely trained, were at the absolute top of their game. Before the Operation Desert Storm in 1991, they'd undertaken an intense period of training, building on the already extensive training that they'd received in Europe at the back end of the Cold War, whereas the Iraqi tankers that they were up against were trained to only the most minimal level that they could in no conceivable respect seriously challenge the far better trained and far better organized and far better led American tankers in those battles. One must assume, in fact, it is an absolute certainty that Russian tankers are trained to an immeasurably higher level than Saddam Hussein's tankers were. I'm not going to argue or claim that they're trained up to the level of the American tankers that Colonel Davis led. Perhaps they are, perhaps they're not. I don't know one way or the other. But certainly the Russians, who regularly stage competitions between tankers, this is a sort of tank game that they run every year or so in Russia. Anyway, they seem to do quite well in these competitions, which I presume are reasonably reflective of training levels. And I have no doubt at all that the Russians are indeed highly trained, or at least very well trained, in the use of their own tanks. I can add a further contribution to this in that I am acquainted with an Iranian engineer who served as a tank maintenance repair specialist during the Iran-Iraq war. And over the course of that war, he says that the Iranians found that they were in fact comprehensively outmatched. Their tanks were comprehensively outmatched by the Russian tanks they were up against, the T-62s with their smoothbore guns, but also and most specifically by the T-72s with their smoothbore guns, the ones that, of course, Colonel Davis defeated in the 1991 Iraq War. Anyway, this engineer had an opportunity to examine captured Russian T-72s, captured from the Saddam Hussein's army, And, well, he was mightily impressed by what he found and what the Iranian technicians found. They found that the smoothbore gun, which was unusual in terms of tank technology in the 1970s and early 1980s, was extremely powerful. It had tremendous penetration capabilities, that the tank was relatively small and nimble, and that meant that it could operate quite effectively on the desert battlefield and could vanish into the heat haze, which, with the kind of sighting systems that the Iranians have, was challenging. And he also said that the engine, the actual engine that the original T-72, Saddam Hussein's T-72s had, the original Soviet-designed engine, and the first generation T-72s, in his opinion, was much more powerful than the specifications which have been published concerning it. He said that the Iranians had private discussions with the Germans about the power output of this particular engine. And the consensus was that it was much higher than the 750 horsepower that the tank was supposed to have, and that the Germans were actually rather baffled about how a tank of such a small engine was able to, a tank engine with those dimensions, was capable of producing that level of power output. Just saying. He did make criticisms of the T-72. He said that ergonomically, in terms of the comfort of the crew, he said his words to describe it were that it was inhuman, that operating these tanks required men who not only possessed exceptionally high levels of training and who were also very aggressive in their willingness to operate these tanks, but who were also extremely fit, and that the tank was very uncomfortable, and that it could only be operated even by tankers of that level of skill and fitness for a relatively short time. He said that the small dimensions of the tank meant that the recoil of the gun would have been absolutely shattering for anybody inside, but tankers, Russian tankers, would have been trained to absorb something of that nature. He said it would have been very difficult indeed to imagine the Iranian tankers that had trained previously with the American M6s and Chieftains. They would have had a long, hard job transitioning to the T-72. But overall, he was very, very impressed by it indeed. This is a somewhat long diversion, but Brian Belletic does make the point that the assumption that the T-72 is an inferior and backward vehicle, anyway, it is not confirmed by the facts. The original T-72, according to this Iranian engineer, was a very formidable tank indeed when it was first deployed in Europe by the Soviets in the 1970s. And the updated and modernized T-72s that are the most common tank in the Russian forces on the Ukrainian battlefields is a formidable tank, formidably manned, and that it has had, well, we have seen that it has just won a tank duel with an American Abrams. So, there we are, just a long diversion on this point. I suspect, by the way, that Colonel Davis has it just about right, which is that, yes, American tanks, very high standard tanks, but that ultimately what makes the difference is training, motivation by the tankers, which is, after all, a product to a great degree of training, and leadership from the unit commanders, which again one suspects the Russians possess to a much higher degree than the Ukrainians do. Now, putting aside this diversion, I just wanted to say that, in fact, the reality is that the Ukrainian war is turning into a graveyard of Western-supplied military hardware. I discussed how a couple of days ago the Russians were able to destroy and were able to provide pictures, film, corroborating that they did destroy 3 HIMARS launch vehicles all in one day. They've also been successful, not just in destroying HIMARS vehicles and lots of Ukrainian air defense systems, as I discussed yesterday in my program, but they're destroying lots and lots of Western supplied armored vehicles as well. I've discussed already the Abrams tanks, 4 of them lost in the space, I think, of 10 days. We also are getting lots of reports of other Western systems being destroyed too. So, to give an example, over the last 3 days, the Russians claim to have destroyed 2 French-produced Caesar howitzers. Now, these were the very advanced, very precise, very long-range howitzers developed by the French military. Macron provided Ukraine with 18 of these. The French provided Ukraine with 18 of these. Denmark gave up its entire fleet of Caesar howitzers to Ukraine, bringing the total of Caesar howitzers provided to Ukraine to 37. It turns out that the gun has proved temperamental and difficult to operate on the battlefield. I remember reading some time ago a complaint from Ukrainian soldiers who operate them that because of the very high pressure on the gun barrel and the general fragility of this vehicle, of this gun, it can only fire a couple of rounds a day. I seem to remember it was pretty much down to just 1 round a day, but that might be, I might have been wrong. I might be wrong about that. But anyway, whatever, the Russians have just destroyed 2 over the course of 3 days, and they've destroyed several others. This is, of course, their claims, but I should say that I believe Russian claims, that they are, when they make claims about the specific destruction of vehicles. We have seen that these claims, when the Russian Defense Ministry makes them, ultimately are corroborated from Western and Ukrainian sources. So, Abrams vehicles being destroyed, Caesar howitzers being destroyed. There's a report in the German media today, I think it was from the Süddeutsche Zeitung, that the Ukrainians are very disillusioned and unhappy with the performance of their Leopard 2 tanks. Apparently, more than half of them have now either been knocked out or are no longer operational. The maintenance demands to keep these tanks operating is enormously high. The tanks are, the Leopard 2s are as vulnerable to Russian anti-tank weapons, including, by the way, tank guns, as Russian tank guns, as any other tank that the Ukrainians operate. The tanks are big and heavy and are therefore easily spotted, and in almost every respect they've proved for the Ukrainians a major disappointment. The one thing one could say for the Leopard 2s is that they're probably doing better than the British Challenger 2 tanks. There's another report today in The Sun, which is a British tabloid, which says that 7 out of the 14 Challenger 2s are the only ones Ukraine has which are still operating. In other words, out of the 14 Challenger 2s that Britain sent to Ukraine, only 7 are still working. Now, one Challenger 2 definitely knocked out by the Russians. There are some reports that the Russians might have knocked out a further 1 or perhaps 2, but it seems that at least 4 others have basically entirely broken down. That the British, like the Germans, by the way, with the Leopard 2s, are struggling to provide the spare parts in order to keep these tanks operating. And there is a rather, well, I suppose one could call it comical, but rather sad picture of a Challenger 2, which is basically, well, so far as I can see, it appears to have sunk into the mud and basically cannot move because of that. Now, I remember giving exactly that warning myself, that these tanks, the Challenger 2s, which weigh all up well over 70 tons, were almost certainly too heavy for operations in the Rasputitsa period in Ukraine, that they really were not designed for the Ukrainian landscape. That was my inexpert view. But, well, I say inexpert view, but I have had some background, not in operating commercial vehicles. I don't have a trucker's license or anything like that. But I have dealt with logistical matters, and I know a little bit about big machines and things. And I did wonder and doubt whether the Challenger 2s at that kind of weight would really be suitable for Ukrainian conditions. Not only was there a risk that during the Rasputitsa, the ground itself would be too soft, but I did wonder whether these tanks were really appropriate to cross the bridges, the many bridges that crisscross this area, this landscape as well. The Donbass is full of small rivers and streams, and there are bridges across these rivers and streams. And, well, they're relatively small. Russian tanks can cross these bridges because they were designed for this kind of landscape. These bumbling, clattering, noisy behemoths, I'm guessing that they're noisy, which are the Challenger 2s. I was wondering whether they would, in fact, be capable of operating on these roads and crossing these bridges. I am guessing not. And anyway, we now have a photograph, apparently, of a Challenger 2 wallowing in the mud of the Rasputitsa. Now, I say all of that. I remember that Colonel Hamish de Breton Gordon argued otherwise. He said that the Challenger 2s were much better adapted to operating in muddy conditions than the Russian tanks, that they had, that they were higher off the ground, and that meant that they were less likely to be clogged up by the mud than the Russian tanks, which sit lower. My own view about that, again, I'm not an expert here, but I would have thought that ground pressure, the amount of weight that you get at any particular point of the tank, that's probably a better gauge of how well adapted the Challenger 2s actually are to this kind of landscape, and I doubt that the ground pressure of the Challenger 2s can match that of the Russian tanks. I understand from Jim Kinnair's exemplary books that Russian tanks, specifically the T-34, tend to have very wide tracks, wider than those of Western tanks. And of course, those wider tracks are better adapted for soft ground because they reduce the ground pressure. Perhaps, or most probably, that's what has made the real difference. So Hamish de Bretton-Gordon looks like he was probably wrong about this, about the better adaptability of the Challenger 2s to the muddy conditions in Ukraine. And of course, he did make some other quite astonishing claims about Russian tanks. He said that the tank guns on the Russian tanks weren't properly stabilized so that they couldn't fire on the move. All I can say is I would strongly urge Hamish de Bretton-Gordon to read Jim Kinnair's books, because if he does, he will have discovered that the situation is otherwise. For the record, the only so-called tank that I'm aware of that has been deployed by any side in this conflict, which does not have a properly stabilized gun and which is indeed incapable of firing on the move, is the AMX-10RC, the so-called wheeled tank that was supplied to the Ukrainians and which appears to have disappeared from the battlefields. So, a complete graveyard for Western vehicles. They're proving ill-adapted to the conditions. The Ukrainians are struggling to maintain them. Brian Beletic has written extensively and fascinatingly, he's discussed extensively and fascinatingly how the United States, and one must assume the other Western powers, never really developed a program to maintain and sustain these machines in action. Brian Beletic and many others have also made the point that this higgledy-piggledy mix-up of tanks and vehicles that are operating on the battlefield, German vehicles, French vehicles, British vehicles, American vehicles, all of them built to completely different specifications, that this is turned into a logistical nightmare for the Ukrainians who are trying to keep all of these complex and very different machines all operating at the same time, alongside what's left of their own stock of ex-Soviet vehicles. And, well, overall, this has all turned out rather badly. And I'm going to return later in this program to this complex question of ammunition supply. But as various commentators are pointing out, including perhaps most strikingly Simplicius the Thinker, and also, again, Brian Beletic, putting aside the West's well-known problems with ammunition supply, which don't seem to have been resolved, the other problem the West is facing, and the Ukrainians are facing, is that Western gun barrels, as we discussed with the Caesar howitzers, precisely because they operate at higher pressures than Russian guns, are wearing out much faster than Russian guns, and there is no system to replace barrels quickly in Ukraine, whereas the Russians not only have production lines keeping their artillery supplied constantly with fresh barrels, but anyway, there are problems altogether keeping these Western guns operating. We see with the Caesar howitzers that after the expenditure of only a limited number of rounds, the barrels basically wear out. So, not a good situation, not a good advertisement for Western equipment and Western machines. All the stories that we've been brought up with, that I was brought up with for many years, which I sort of believed, why wouldn't I, that Western equipment is, well, vastly superior to that the Soviets and the Russians have, turning out not to be true. Brian Beletic discusses all this in his recent video. I would suggest you go and watch him, and he'll discuss it all there with a much more expert understanding than I can. All I would say again is that we are seeing air defense systems, HIMARS systems fail. We're seeing Patriots, NASAMS, IRIS-Ts being destroyed. We're seeing tanks being destroyed. We're seeing, well, Bradley's being destroyed. One of the Abrams tanks, knocked out Abrams tanks, appears to have been captured by the Russians. Apparently there's a film showing Russian soldiers taking selfies next to it. So presumably that will be trundled off eventually and displayed somewhere in Moscow after the Russian technicians have pored over it. Anyway, one way or the other, this has not been a good marketing exercise for Western equipment. Now, that ought to, I would have thought, putting aside the question of marketing, call into question the wisdom of further Western military aid equipment being sent to Ukraine. Now, here I am not talking about the marketing aspect, but if Ukraine is having all of these problems operating Abrams tanks and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and large numbers of these have been destroyed now, and Caesar howitzers, things of that kind, and if the Ukrainians are using Patriot and French Aspeed surface-to-air missiles in inappropriate ways, instead of keeping them in protected, static locations around major defense points like Kiev itself, they're trying to move them around the battlefield in order, going on a fool's errand of trying to shoot down Russian aircraft so that the Russians are able to keep track of where these heavy, cumbersome launchers are and then destroy them. If they're doing all of this and they're burning up Western equipment at this level, and it's important to say that some of these machines are not being produced anymore. I understand that Leopard 2s can be returned to production, though the current production of these tanks stopped. I might be wrong about this. The United States does still produce Abrams tanks, but at a relatively low level. I believe the Bradleys are no longer produced any longer. The M777s are not produced any longer. France is having to restart, apparently, production of the Caesar howitzers, and that is a protracted business, apparently making one of these things. French industry needed 30 months to make one howitzer, which seems incredible to me. They're claiming that they've managed to reduce that to 15 months, which still seems incredibly long to me. But anyway, it's going to prove very, very difficult to replace this equipment and to make up for the speed with which it is being lost. And I would have thought, given that it is being lost at this stratospheric speed, relatively speaking, it would not be a good idea for the West, whose arsenals of equipment are already becoming dangerously depleted, to pour in still more of these machines, still more tanks, still more Bradleys, still more Marders, more of those destroyed as well. They've been out of production for a long time. Still more M777s. Production of M777s in Northern Ireland is apparently due to restart. There are problems apparently in the United States making some types of ammunition for these guns because the copyright is held by the British company that builds them. And anyway, there's all these multiplicity of disputes and arguments and things that needs to be ironed out. Anyway, I would have thought that rather than pour even more of a depleting arsenal of weapons into Ukraine, it might be wise to take a step back and to say that if Ukraine isn't able to operate successfully, the weapons, the Western weapons, which have already been supplied, why continue to supply more and more weapons? It's not, after all, as if the United States has limitless supplies of Patriot systems that it can simply give away to Ukraine. It is short of missiles for these systems. Even its Bradley inventory, much bigger, but it's not unlimited. And the same is even true of its Abrams tanks, though so far the delivery of these Abrams tanks has been a relatively small one. So rather than burn up machines and missiles, why not instead tell the Ukrainians, look, we've given you all you can, all we safely can. It would put our military position in jeopardy if we just went on investing in this sort of way. In all the circumstances, this isn't working, and we need to think afresh and change our tactics and our strategy, and perhaps stop supplying you with all this very expensive equipment. $19 billion, supposedly the cost of the Patriot systems, just the Patriot systems, which have now been destroyed. Anyway, it's much better to stop doing this and to think anew and come up with a new strategy, and that might be a political one instead of a military one. Just saying. Anyway, obviously that isn't going to happen. That isn't happening for the moment. But one can see the problems which are growing. Anyway, having discussed this graveyard of Western equipment, which is what Ukraine is turning into, let us now return to the topic of what is going on the battlefronts. Now, over the last couple of days, Dima, the military summary channel, has been telling us that the Ukrainians are coming up with a new plan for a further offensive, that this is another cross-border, cross-river advance across the Dnieper. This isn't going to be in Krinky this time. It's not apparently intended to advance towards Crimea. It is intended to capture the Kinburn Spit and another area of islands and another spit near at the very end of the mouth of the Dnieper, supposedly in order to reopen Nikolaev for shipments for once again to merchant shipping. Well, it's possible. It's quite likely that the Ukrainians do have that kind of plan. Zelensky is always looking for new opportunities to throw away the lives of his soldiers in pointless and disastrous offensives. According to Dima, at the military summary channel, the Ukrainians also concentrated large numbers of troops and equipment near to the Russian border in areas like Belgorod and towns further south. And he thinks that the Ukrainians were thinking of another advance across the Russian border, attempting to capture villages. He talks about some very complex Ukrainian plan to capture one particular village and to encircle the Russian soldiers advancing towards Terny and Kupiansk. I have to say, it reminds me of a little of the offensive plan the Ukrainians supposedly had during the Battle of Avdiivka to advance against the village of Krasnogorovka. This is a different place completely from the town of Krasnogorovka further south, which the Ukrainians still control and which is now being bitterly fought over and contested. The village of Krasnogorovka, north of Avdiivka, captured by the Russians a year ago, providing the foundation for the subsequent Russian advance on Avdiivka. Anyway, I remember Dima speculating that the Ukrainians were planning a counterattack to recapture that particular village, and this supposedly would cause the Russians in Avdiivka to fall into a semi-cauldron. And the advance that he's now talking about, that the Ukrainians might have planned into Russian territory, supposedly intended to do the same thing with respect to Kupiansk, Russian forces in Kupiansk and Liman. Well, all I can say is it's entirely possible that the Ukrainians are coming up with these plans. They're being massively bombed by the Russians on the west bank of the Dnieper and Kherson region. Though I can't say that looks any different to me from what has been happening before. The assault on Belgorod and on other Russian towns to the northwest, in the northwest of the battle lines, appears to have been preempted by the Russians. They detected these Ukrainian concentrations that were supposed to lead these attacks and have launched missile and drone and bomb strikes upon them, and apparently large numbers of Ukrainian troops and vehicles have been destroyed. But I'm not going to try and second guess Ukrainian plans. These plans, if they exist, seem to me completely misguided given the relative situation on the battlefronts. I would have thought it would make far more sense for the Ukrainians, to the extent that they can, to retreat and to try to create more effective and durable fortified lines than those they have created up to this point, rather than throw away their resources on what seem to me reckless operations of this kind. But it would not surprise me at all, having said that, if Zelensky and Syrskyi are indeed coming up with these reckless operations, plans for these reckless operations instead. All I will say is, if they have, the Russians clearly know all about them, and if and when the Ukrainians do attack, the Russians will be ready for them. What the Russians will do, or what they plan in response to all of this, I'm not sure, but operations that lack the element of surprise against a military that is more powerful than your own don't seem to me at all a good idea. Anyway, I'm not going to, as I say, discuss these plans further. But what is actually in the meantime happening on the battlefronts? Well, we've not had further news today from the Orlovka, Toninka, Berdichi area, except for the fact that the Abrams tank was destroyed in Berdichi. It seems as if the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back to the western outskirts of Berdichi, so it looks like they control most of this village, just as they control most of Toninka and most of Orlovka. There are claims that Syrski is doing what he always does. He's rushing more reinforcements to try to hold these positions. We see that the Russian Air Force is active. The Russians are striking at Ukrainian positions with their ground attacks, Sukhoi 25 aircraft, perhaps even Russian helicopters before long. Kamov 52s and Mi-28s will start to appear over the skies in this area too. Ukrainian losses, again, tremendously high. The Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with a further update, and it claims that in the fighting, 11 counterattacks, as they put it, of the 24th, 47th Mechanized and 3rd Assault Brigades were repelled near Novobakhmutkovka, this is another place, but also Berdichi, Orlovka and Toninka, and that the enemy lost more than 430 troops, 1 US-made Abrams tank, that's the one I've just been talking about, 2 armored fighting vehicles and 18 motor vehicles. So again, Ukrainian losses incredibly high as they try to hold this line. They've been pushed, it seems, out of Berdichi. They're clinging on to just a few locations in Toninka and Orlovka. It looks as if the Russians have gained control of something like 90% of Toninka. Again, Dima at the military summary channel pointed out that the Russians, in theory, are already in a position, given the territory they control, or are likely to control in Toninka, to be able to send armored forces further west from Toninka to the southwest, putting in grave jeopardy the entire Ukrainian defense positions in this area. Again, of course, whether the Russians intend to do that is another matter. But again, it seems to me that once more, Syrski is reinforcing failure, throwing away lives and valuable machines, and he's just lost another Abrams tank and does what he always does, blame the commander, in this case of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, and sack him for that failure. Anyway, he's throwing away lives and throwing away machines, buying himself a few more days to no obvious purpose that I am able to see. So that battle still continues, and the Russian Air Force, to repeat again, remains active. And we have also now had apparently a lot more visual confirmation about the situation in the Liman area. It seems that the Russians are indeed now on the outskirts of Terny, the village on the Zherebets River. It looks as if they have not actually stormed or captured Terny. The reports that they had done, I become skeptical about those reports. It looks as if those reports were wrong, and it looks increasingly as if the Russians, however, are very close indeed to a situation where they will indeed launch an attack on Terny, in which case all the indicators are that they will be able to capture this village and were able to reach the Zherebets River and collapse the Ukrainian defenses in this area. And we've had less information from Novomikhailivka. It doesn't mean that the fighting there isn't as intense as always. Probably it is. But what we do know is that the Russians are continuing to bomb Krasnogorovka. And the size of the explosions is simply enormous. And there are more and more reports that the bombs that are being used by the Russians to bomb Ukrainian positions in Krasnogorovka are these big FAB 1500 bombs. Now, here there is an intrigue, because CNN has now written a long piece about the introduction of the FAB 1500 bombs and the way in which they're turning into a game changer, that they are vastly more powerful, or at least more devastating in their effect, than the FAB 500 bombs, which the Russians have been using previously, that it is incredibly difficult for soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, to withstand, I mean, if they're not killed, the effect of these bombs on them is tremendous, that being anywhere close to the location of where one of these bombs fall is a guarantee of a severe concussion, quite apart from the overall effect that, the destructive effect of these bombs. And we've also had, interestingly enough, from the Russian media, a rather interesting discussion of the cost of these things. And we're told, and this is apparently coming from Yuri Ignat, that the bombs, these FAB 1500 bombs, are obviously they don't, they do cost a certain amount of money. He went on to say that it is pennies in comparison with a missile. And we're also learned that independent estimates by Russian military observers say that while FAB bombs equipped with UMPC modules, these are the modules that turn them into precision-guided bombs, are inferior to missiles in terms of their range characteristics, their price is significantly lower, making them superior in both cost and firepower to major ballistic and cruise missiles, including those used by the Iskander missile system. And that the estimate is that the FAB 1500's lower tier cousin, the FAB 500, has an approximate price tag of as little as $3,200 apiece. That's 300,000 missiles. The addition of the UMPC module adds 30 to 50% of the price, but this still is only a fraction of the cost of an Calibre or Iskander missile. A Calibre missile costs around $500,000 apiece. An Iskander missile costs around $4.3 million apiece. So we would be looking at a bomb that has the similar destructive power to an Iskander missile, which costs about $5,000 against the cost of an Iskander missile, which is $4.3 million. Now, of course, when making these kind of comparisons in terms of cost, it is essential to remember that the launch vehicle that launches these bombs, the Sukhoi 34 fighter jet or fighter bomber, well, that is a very, very expensive platform indeed. But unless it is shot down, the Ukrainians have claimed to have shot down a fair number of these Sukhoi 34s. though, as we see, there is, as I've discussed in previous programs, there is good reason to doubt that. Barring claims that the Ukrainians have shot down Sukhoi 34s, the Sukhoi 34s are reusable. Whereas, of course, if you're launching an Iskander missile, well, $4 million worth of equipment is launched and it might cause a deadly impact, but it's still a fully expended expense. So we can see, it is possible to see how these bombs are incredibly effective. And the CNN article tells us some very interesting things, that these bombs are launched from a significant distance of around 50 kilometers. We're talking about the FAB 1500s, 50 kilometers from the target, by aircraft operating at altitudes of around 10 kilometers. So I understand. And, well, I'm not sure whether it's the altitudes. Anyway, but a fair distance from the targets. That Ignat says that the bulk of Ukrainian air defense systems cannot intercept the Russian aircraft at those sort of ranges. He didn't exactly say this, but I got the impression from the CNN article that he thinks only the Patriots can do that. Perhaps the S-300s could, in theory, do that as well. That doubtless explains the decision, must be a very controversial decision, to forward deploy the Patriots and the S-300s to the contact line, which has resulted in their mass destruction, which I talked about yesterday. And even if they are forward deployed in that way, it is far from straightforward to intercept the launch aircraft, and it is all but impossible to intercept the bombs. Now that is interesting because the Russians, by contrast, are claiming regularly now that they are successfully intercepting such limited numbers of precision-guided bombs as the Ukrainians are using. The Ukrainians have obtained a certain number of JDAMS bombs from the United States, and these are their aircraft do launch them from time to time. Presumably these are mainly launched by MiG-29s, though the Russians are continuing to shoot down MiG-29s. And the French have also supplied the Ukrainians with similar Hammer precision-guided bombs, though only in small numbers, or certainly small numbers, compared to what the Russians are using, the numbers of precision-guided bombs that the Russians are using. We're talking about a difference of about 50 Hammer bombs provided by France to Ukraine each month against well over 100 precision-guided bombs dropped by the Russian Air Force across the contact line in Ukraine each day. That is the scale of the difference. So anyway, the Russians apparently can intercept Ukrainian precision-guided bombs. I'm not saying that they are always successful, but according to their claims, they have been able to do that. Ignat basically tells us that that is beyond Ukraine's air defense capabilities. I'm just saying. So, a situation where these huge aerial bombs, 1500, FAB 1500s, are now apparently starting to appear on the battlefronts in larger numbers. Apparently the Sukhoi 34s are able to launch these big bombs. Their effect is indeed apparently devastating, and it is smashing Ukrainian defenses. And if the Russians reach the Ukrainian fortified lines to the extent that they exist, the Russians can bring to bear these massive bombs against those fortified lines. The Ukrainians were unable to do that against the Russian fortified lines during the Zaporozhye offensive. Not, though, that they ever really reached them. Anyway, so very bad situation in the Avdiivka area, a deteriorating situation in the Terni area in Liman. We've had less news today from the Bakhmut area. Yesterday, I said that it looks as if the battle for Ivanivska is now coming close to an end, that the Russians now appear to control nearly all of this village. Again, the Ukrainians are clinging on to some positions on its western outskirts, but that the Russians are gradually squeezing the Ukrainians out of this village, and the Russians continuing their their big bombing operation against Krasnogorovka, with the devastating effect that the Ukrainians themselves are acknowledging to CNN, and likely we're going to see a ground operation launched to capture Krasnogorovka at some point over the next few days or weeks. So, to repeat again, a deteriorating picture for Ukraine and a crisis in terms of Western equipment being sent to Ukraine. Every single piece of equipment the West has sent to Ukraine up to this point has failed to a degree. Perhaps, if you want to push it, the only piece of equipment that has had any degree of success are the water drones launched against the Russian fleet. But again, that depends very much on the assumption that Ukrainian claims to have damaged or destroyed all of these Russian ships are true. Just saying. Now, the other weapon system that I failed to talk about are, of course, the Storm Shadows and the Taurus missiles. The Storm Shadows, a lot was expected of them. It seems to me, again, they've not lived up to expectations. They've done a certain amount of damage. The Russian air defense system appears to have found means to counter them. And Germany very much at odds with itself about whether to supply Taurus missiles. The German military, most of them I suspect, and the German public opposed to the supply of Taurus missiles. The Chancellor Scholz opposed to the supply of Taurus missiles. Defense Minister Pistorius apparently saying that he is also disinclined to supply them, even as he asks German officers to brief him on how the supply of Taurus missiles might work. And of course, and entirely predictably, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock now coming forward and hinting very broadly and openly that yes, perhaps Germany should supply Taurus missiles. And the British, David Cameron, has now come up with a cunning plan. He's telling the Germans, well, let's do a swap. We will give you Storm Shadows in return for you giving us Taurus missiles, which we will, of course, then supply to Ukraine. that will mean that you are not supplying the Taurus missiles to Ukraine. It means that we are. I am incredulous that these childish ploys are being used in that way. But unsurprisingly, Annalena Baerbock seems to be reaching out for this one. She seems to be very keen on this idea, as all else fails. So, difficult to see how the situation with sophisticated Western equipment can work out. Now, what about the other problem, ammunition? I'm not going to say more about President Pavel's idea, clever idea, cunning plan to buy 800,000 shells on the international arms market from undisclosed third parties. The Czechs are giving contradictory information about this, and I don't know that anybody really knows exactly what is going on. I've expressed my own deep skepticism about that particular idea. Brian Beletic says that if all of these 800,000 shells were supplied, then it would provide Ukraine with shells for perhaps 4 more months, shells being used at a rate of 6,000 rounds a day. But of course, that begs the question whether the shells would indeed be provided. I have actually received, I should say, a message from someone who has done some actually rather further in-depth research about American shell production. He's provided some very interesting information, and he's also told me about how he obtained this information, which I am absolutely not going to discuss. But anyway, he has provided me with some very interesting information about the situation with shell production in the United States. Now, the very last number that we got from the United States is that they are producing around 28,000 shells a month. This person believes that they could be producing 34 to 36,000 shells, 150,000 shells a month. And at the present time, which is more than than Undersecretary Bush said, I suspect that we are seeing rising numbers. He also thinks that perhaps the Americans might be producing an extra 3,000 to 5,000 more shells a month at some point in the next 6 to 8 months. That's to say, by the end of the year. That would bring total US production of shells to around 40,000. My calculations are correct, by the end of this year. And we're also told that the Europeans might have increased production from their previous totals to about 3,000 to 5,000, over the last recently. That, by the way, matches accurately with a claim by the French defense minister that France has increased shell production to about 3,000 rounds a month from a previous 1,000 rounds a month. It's been suggested that a lot of the production extra production that might be taking place in Europe might be taking place with the assistance of the Czechs. Now, the Czechs, of course, have a highly developed, or used to have a highly developed, explosives industry. We've all heard of Semtex, I suppose, and perhaps that's playing a role here. But anyway, the long and the short of it is that these figures don't come anywhere close to matching Ukrainian needs. Even the combined totals of American and European production, at their most optimistic, by the end of the year, would not suffice to resolve Ukraine's long-term needs for shells. It's proving a challenge to raise production. The Ukrainians are still wanting or needing more shells than the West is producing, and the West, of course, has to retain some of these shells for its own use and supply them also to its other customers. Now, the Saudis, I suspect, the Pakistanis probably have all been leaned on to supply shells to Ukraine. Whether they'll be willing to do that, of course, is another question again, and what the quality of these shells would be. That too, or so it seems to me, is another question. Again, I'm not going to get into a discussion of that. And of course, there is always other expedients that can be used, using more FPV drones. I've discussed that already. I would add one further thing, which is that, of course, shell production remains incredibly important, and it's quite clear to me that the Russians are now well ahead of the West in shell production, and I'm going to make a guess that by the end of this year, the gap will, if anything, have grown rather than diminished. And that's putting aside the unknown issues about whether shell production in Russia is being supplemented with imports of shells from North Korea. But of course, now, if we're talking about firepower, it's no longer just a question of shells, because we see increasing use by the Russians of these heavy bombs, the FAB 500s and FAB 1500s across the Ukrainian battlefronts. And of course, each bomb, FAB 500 and FAB 1500 bomb, contains far more high explosive than any single shell, and we see the devastating effect that these bombs can do. So how can Ukraine balance that out? I don't see it. Now, let's return to this enigma, the talk about the French, other European states sending troops to Ukraine, because this is a topic which won't die. Boris Pistorius has told the French to stop talking about this, but President Macron insists on doing it, causing increasing strains with the Germans and I suspect with other countries. Italy, by the way, has now also come out. The Italian defense minister has also come out strongly opposing this policy. Now, it's been suggested by some people, Simplicius the thinker, for example, that if European troops entered Ukraine, the Russians would not be able to stop it. He is skeptical about whether the Russians would respond by launching strikes against Western countries in retaliation to this. And he also appears to think that the presence of Western troops in Western Ukraine, in places like Odessa, Kiev, along the Dnieper, might indeed act as some kind of a tripwire which the Russians would be unable to cross, some kind of shield for the Ukrainians, which the Russians would be unable to cross. I have to say, I think this is a complete misunderstanding of the situation. I don't think the Russians, if French or British troops or troops of the Baltic states were deployed to Ukraine, would have attacked France or Britain or even the Baltic states. What they would do is that they would launch attacks upon these French and British and Baltic troops in Ukraine. The Russian Foreign Ministry has openly has demanded that the Western powers finally acknowledge publicly and formally that which is already now universally known, that there are already Western military personnel operating in Ukraine. The Russians have also made it clear that they see these Western military personnel in Ukraine as legitimate targets for their forces conducting the special military operation. It is widely assumed that Western operators were caught up in that missile strike against the Ukrainian Patriot missile system near Pokrovsk, which of course destroyed those two Patriot launchers and attendant vehicles. And of course, the Russians have shown no hesitation in launching missile strikes and other strikes against people who their home governments, their Western governments say are volunteers or mercenaries, if you will, but whom the Russians consider to be Western soldiers operating under contract, perhaps formally to Ukraine, but underwritten by Western governments. What the Russians will do if French or British troops enter Ukraine is launch missile strikes and bomb strikes and artillery strikes against those troops and engage them in military action, so long as they remain on the territory of Ukraine, whilst the special military operation continues to be underway. The Russians will simply treat these troops as combatants. And Big Serge, one of the most astute commentators about the war, he has just published a report about the state of the French army, highly trained troops, no doubt, but ill-equipped to engage the Russians in a war in Ukraine. We have seen how Ukraine is a graveyard for Western military equipment. Deploying troops, Western troops to Ukraine, is a recipe for making it a graveyard for Western troops also. This is a disastrous idea. The Germans are right to oppose it, so are the Italians, so is the United States, and it needs to be dropped at once. If there is no other way than this to prevent Ukraine going down, then the reality is that Ukraine is going down. Escalating with these kind of plans to prevent that happening is reckless, and it makes better sense to begin negotiations right away. Well, this is where I finish today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can buy all the amazing things you will find there. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. It's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.